Imagine a city defined not by its roads, but by its currents. In the year 1650, London was a sprawling, chaotic masterpiece of timber and stone clinging to the banks of the River Thames. As the morning mist lifts, the first thing you see isn't the skyline we know today, but a forest of wooden masts. Great merchant vessels, their hulls scarred by Atlantic salt, sit heavy in the water, bringing the world to England's doorstep. The heart of this world was Old London Bridge. Before it was a transit point, it was a wonder. Imagine a street suspended over a roaring tide, lined so densely with houses and shops that you could cross the river without ever seeing the water beneath your feet. But listen closely. Beneath the domestic chatter above, the Thames was screaming. The massive stone piers of the bridge acted like a dam, forcing the river through narrow gaps. The water didn't just flow, it boiled. To shoot the bridge in a small wooden wherry was a gamble with death, a feat of navigation that only the most skilled ferryman dared. Nearby, the Tower of London stood as a silent grey sentinel. In the 1660s, it wasn't just a museum, it was a living fortress. It was the Royal Mint, the armory, and the most feared cage in the kingdom. When you look at its walls from the river, you aren't just looking at stone, you are looking at the absolute weight of the English state. Stepping off the river and into the city streets was a shock to the senses. London in the 1600s was a labyrinth. The streets were so narrow that the upper stories of timber-framed houses leaned toward each other, nearly touching, blocking out the sun and trapping the smell of coal smoke and refuse. Walking through Cheapside, you would find yourself in the commercial engine of the empire. This wasn't a place for the faint of heart. The ground was a permanent slurry of mud and waste, churned by the iron-rimmed wheels of heavy wooden carts. Merchants, Englishmen in wool doublets and stiff collars moved through the crowds in silence. There was no quiet here. The air was filled with the rhythmic strike of hammers, the bleating of livestock driven to market, and the constant chime of church bells. When the sun dipped below the overhanging eaves, the city turned inward. People retreated into dark, timber-lined taverns. By the light of a single guttering candle, the day's toil was washed away with ale served in heavy pewter mugs. There was a grim intimacy to this life, a city of 500,000 people living shoulder to shoulder, unaware that the very wood and pitch that sheltered them was a ticking bomb. But London had another face, one of white stone, silk, and absolute ceremony. West of the city's crowded core lay Whitehall and Westminster. This was the London of the Stuarts. Here, the architecture changed from medieval timber to classical elegance. The Banqueting House at Whitehall stood as a monument to royal ambition, its stone facade a stark contrast to the crooked alleys of the city. In these gardens, the air was cleaner. You would see courtiers moving like silent ghosts in rustling silks, their lives governed by rigid etiquette. But even here, tension was brewing. In the mid-17th century, the street of Cheapside often became a stage for power. Imagine a royal procession, the thrum of drums, the glint of sunlight on steel pikes, and the king's carriage rolling through a crowd that was increasingly divided. The political heart beat at Westminster Abbey and the old palace of Westminster. In 1647, these stone cloisters saw the shadows of men who would eventually challenge the divine right of kings. The abbey wasn't just a church, it was the spiritual anchor of a nation on the brink of civil war. It stood as a reminder that while the markets traded in cloth and coal, this ground traded in the souls and laws of England. When night fell, London became a different world, a dangerous one. Without streetlights, the darkness was absolute. If you had the coin, you hired a link boy, a child carrying a flaming pitch torch to guide you through the fog. The torchlight would catch the glint of wet cobblestones and the occasional scurrying rat, the silent carrier of the plague that haunted these decades. Life was hard and the elements were unforgiving. In the coldest winters, the Thames would do the unthinkable. It would freeze solid. The Great Frost transformed the river into a wasteland of ice. But Londoners were resilient. They didn't hide. They built tents, lit fires, and held frost fairs on the very spot where ships usually sailed. Yet, justice was as cold as the ice. To enter the city from the south, you had to pass under the Southwark Gate of London Bridge. There, on high pikes, the sun-bleached skulls of traitors stared down at the travelers. It was a grisly warning. The city offered fortune, but it demanded total obedience. Those who failed found themselves in Newgate Prison, a place of damped stone and rattling chains, where the only thing cheaper than life was hope. Then came September 1666. It began in the smallest of ways, a spark in a bakery on Pudding Lane. In a city built of dry wood, packed tightly together and parched by a long summer, that spark was a death sentence. The fire didn't just burn, it hunted. Driven by a fierce eastern wind, it leapt from roof to roof. Imagine the sound, not just the crackle of flame, but a roar like an ocean of fire. Timber beams snapped like dry twigs. The sky turned a bruised orange, and the Thames reflected a city that looked like the mouth of hell. The greatest tragedy was old St. Paul's Cathedral. It was the massive Gothic heart of London, thought to be invincible behind its stone walls. But the scaffolding around it caught fire, and the heat became so intense that the lead on the roof melted. Witnesses described a river of molten silver flowing down the streets. By the time the wind died down, the medieval city, the London of Shakespeare, was nothing but a landscape of white ash and jagged, blackened chimneys. In the wake of the fire, the silence was deafening. The ruins smoked for months. But even as the ash settled, a new vision was being drawn. Christopher Wren, a man of science and stars, sat over parchment maps, reimagining a city of brick and stone. The London that rose from the grave was different. The dangerous overhanging timber was banned. In its place came the steady, rhythmic scrape of trowels against red brick. The city grew wider, cleaner, and more orderly. The crown jewel of this rebirth was the new St. Paul's Cathedral. For years, the skyline was dominated by wooden scaffolds and the sound of hammers against Portland stone, until finally the Great Dome rose, a symbol of a city that could not be broken. By 1690, as the sun set over a rebuilt London, the medieval ghost was gone. The city had traded its wooden charm for stone permanence. It was the end of an era and the beginning of the modern world. We look back at these AI reconstructed moments not just to see how they lived, but to remember that every stone in modern London sits upon the ashes of a world that was once just as vibrant, just as crowded, and just as alive as our own.